Part 1. The Fading Throne. A Kingdom on the Edge of Succession. There is a moment in the life of every great empire when the question that no one dares to speak aloud finally rises to the surface. It is the question of what comes next. Who will carry the weight of the throne? Who will hold together what took a lifetime, or a generation, to build? In the ancient world, succession was never simply a legal process. It was a battleground. Kingdoms from the Nile Delta to the plains of Mesopotamia had watched powerful dynasties collapse the moment a king's grip on the scepter began to loosen. Sons conspired against fathers. Generals turned against the royal house. Priests shifted their loyalties. And the people, always watching, always waiting, learned to survive the chaos of transition by aligning themselves with whoever appeared to be winning. This was the world into which the book of 1 Kings opens. And it opens not with a coronation, not with a celebration, but with an old man lying in a palace, unable to keep warm. David, the son of Jesse, shepherd of Bethlehem, giant, slayer, Put, warrior, and king of Israel, had carried the promises of God through decades of danger, devotion, and devastating personal failure. He had built Jerusalem into the city of the great king. He had expanded Israel's borders, subdued surrounding nations, established the Ark of the Covenant at the center of national worship, and received from God himself the extraordinary promise that his throne would endure through his descendants forever. But now, the man who had once run toward Goliath without hesitation could not generate enough warmth in his own body to survive the night air of Jerusalem. His servants brought Abishag the Shunammite, a young woman of extraordinary beauty, to care for the aging king and keep him warm. The scene is deliberately striking. The narrator of 1 Kings places it at the very beginning not to humiliate David, but to establish the condition of the kingdom with brutal honesty. Power was fading. The throne was about to become available, and in the ancient Near East, an available throne was the most dangerous object in the world. What followed next was as old as human ambition itself. Adoniah, one of David's sons, looked at his father's condition and made a decision that would define the opening chapters of this entire book. He said within himself words that kingdoms have heard 1,000 times, across 1,000 generations I will be king. He prepared chariots and horsemen. He gathered men to run before him in royal procession. He secured the support of Joab. The battle, hardened commander of Israel's army, and Abiathar the priest, men whose influence reached deep into the military and religious foundations of the kingdom. From the outside, it looked like a celebration. From the inside, it was a seizure. Adonijah held a feast at the stone of Zoheleth, invited the king's sons and important officials, sacrificed animals in a display of royal ceremony, and carefully excluded every person in Jerusalem who would not support his claim. He did not invite Nathan the prophet. He did not invite Benaiah. He did not invite Solomon. That silence was not an oversight. It was a declaration. But here is what every aspiring king in the ancient world consistently underestimates. The purposes of God are not disrupted by the momentum of human scheming. Nathan the prophet understood exactly what was happening inside the walls of Jerusalem. And he also understood what was at stake. If Adonijah claimed the throne without David's authorization, the lives of Solomon, Bathsheba, and everyone aligned with the true succession were in immediate danger. This was not simply family rivalry. This was a covenant crisis. God had chosen Solomon. David had sworn it, And now a son was attempting to override the word of both his father and his God through public theater and political maneuvering. Nathan moved with wisdom and urgency. He went first to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and instructed her on how to approach David. Then, while she was still speaking to the king, Nathan entered the chamber and confirmed the danger. The strategy was deliberate and precise, not manipulation, but a careful presentation of truth to a king whose body was weak, but whose royal authority was still fully intact. David responded with the decisiveness of a man who had lived his entire life in covenant with God. Though he could not lift a sword, he could still give a royal command. He called for Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, and issued instructions that would leave no room for ambiguity. Solomon was to ride upon the king's own mule, a powerful symbol of royal transfer, and be taken to the Gihon spring, the very water source of Jerusalem, where he would be anointed king over Israel. The trumpet was to sound. The people were to shout, "Long live King Solomon." David was not whispering a private preference from a sickbed. He was making a public, priestly, prophetically witnessed declaration before the entire city. The contrast with Adonijah's unauthorized feast could not have been more dramatic. One gathering was built on ambition and momentum. The other was built on divine appointment and covenant authority. Solomon was placed on the royal mule, taken to Gihon, anointed with oil by Zadok the priest, and the trumpet sounded across Jerusalem. The people rejoiced with such overwhelming noise that the very earth seemed to tremble with the sound of celebration. The news reached Adonijah's feast like a stone through still water. The joy collapsed. The guests scattered. The man who had tried to rise without the king's command now ran to the altar and clung to its horns, begging for mercy. And Solomon's first recorded act as the newly anointed king of Israel was not cruelty. It was measured, conditional mercy. If Adonijah proved faithful, he would live. But if wickedness was found in him, judgment would follow. The throne had been secured. The covenant had been honored. God's purposes had moved forward, not through military force, not through dramatic intervention, but through the courage of a prophet, the faithfulness of a mother, and the undiminished royal authority of a dying king. 1 Kings had announced its central message before the first chapter was even finished. Human ambition may rise with chariots and processions, but it is the word of the Lord that establishes thrones, and it is the faithfulness of those who carry that word that shapes the future of nations. Part 2. The Weight of a Crown. David's final words and Solomon's dangerous inheritance. There is a particular kind of wisdom that only comes at the end of a long life. Wisdom that has been tested by war, shaped by failure, refined by years of walking with God through seasons of victory and devastating personal ruin. David possessed that wisdom, and in the final hours of his life, lying in the palace he had built in Jerusalem, he gathered what remained of his strength and spoke to his son with the full weight of a father, a king, and a covenant servant of God. His words to Solomon were not the nostalgic reflections of an old man reviewing his accomplishments. They were the charge of a dying king who understood something that many rulers across the ancient Near East never grasped, that the throne of Israel was unlike any other throne in the world. It was not sustained by military dominance alone. It was not secured by clever diplomacy or strategic alliances or the accumulation of wealth. The throne of Israel stood on a covenant, and covenants demanded faithfulness, not merely performance. David told Solomon to be strong and to show himself a man, But strength in David's final instruction was defined in a way that would have surprised the generals and power brokers of the ancient world. Before David mentioned a single political matter, before he addressed a single enemy or ally, he told Solomon to keep the charge of the Lord his God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies as written in the law of Moses. Only by walking in those ways. David said, would Solomon truly prosper in everything he did and everywhere he turned? This sequence was intentional and profound. Obedience came first. Prosperity followed obedience, not the other way around. In the great empires surrounding Israel, Egypt with its divine pharaohs, Babylon with its priest, kings, Assyria with its warrior monarchs, the success of a ruler was measured by conquest, by territory, by the riches flowing into the royal treasury. But David's dying charge reoriented everything. The measure of Solomon's reign would not be the breadth of his borders or the weight of his gold. It would be the condition of his heart before God. This single truth, spoken from a deathbed in Jerusalem, would echo through every chapter of First Kings that followed, becoming the standard against which every king, northern and southern, faithful and rebellious, would ultimately be measured. David then turned to the unresolved matters that he was leaving behind. He spoke of Joab, the commander of his army, a man of formidable military skill who had nevertheless shed blood in times of peace, killing Abner and Amasa in ways that stained Israel's honor and violated the spirit of justice that the covenant demanded. He spoke of Shimei, who had cursed David publicly during Absalom's rebellion, an act that carried serious weight in the cultural and legal framework of the ancient Near East, where the spoken word against a divinely appointed king was not simply an insult, but a covenant violation. David also spoke of the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, who had shown extraordinary loyalty during his darkest hour of exile, and he charged Solomon to honor them with the hospitality of the royal table. These instructions revealed something essential about the kingdom Solomon was inheriting. It was not a clean throne handed over in a moment of peaceful transfer. It was a kingdom with old wounds that had never fully healed. Dangerous men whose loyalties were ambiguous. Faithful friends whose kindness had never been properly rewarded. And unresolved questions of justice that hung like shadows over the palace. David was not passing Solomon a trophy. He was handing him a living, complex, fractured human institution that required both wisdom and courage to govern faithfully. Then David died, buried in the city that bore his name, after 40 years of one of the most consequential reigns in the history of the ancient world. But the story of chapter 2 does not end with David's burial. It continues into the dangerous days of transition, revealing that the threats surrounding Solomon were not fully neutralized by the anointing ceremony at Gihon. Adoniah, who had been sent home in conditional mercy, approached Bathsheba with a request that was dressed in the language of innocent affection but carried the weight of political ambition. He asked for Abishag the Shunammite as his wife. In the royal culture of the ancient Near East, this request was far more than a romantic appeal. Taking a woman who had been associated with the previous king was widely understood as a symbolic claim connected to the throne itself. Solomon recognized the danger immediately, and with clear judicial reasoning, he understood that granting such a request would be tantamount to legitimizing a renewed bid for royal power. Adonijah had already tried to seize the kingdom once. His request now, however gently framed, carried the same spirit of ambition dressed in different clothing. Judgment fell swiftly. Abiathar the priest was removed from his sacred office and sent to Anathoth, fulfilling the ancient word spoken against the house of Eli. Joab, who fled to the altar and clung to its horns, was judged for the blood he had shed. The altar offered sanctuary for accidental killing, but not for premeditated violence, and Joab's actions had been deliberate. Benaiah became commander of the army. Zadok became the leading priest. Shimei was placed under a restricted covenant. He could live, but he could not leave Jerusalem. When he later violated that restriction to retrieve runaway servants, judgment came upon him, as Solomon had warned. By the close of chapter 2, the text delivers one of its most important summary statements. The kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. That sentence is not merely a political notation. It is a theological declaration. Every threat had been addressed. Every unresolved matter from David's reign had been brought to its conclusion. The son who had been anointed at Gihon now sat on the throne of David with authority firmly recognized and the kingdom consolidated around him. But 1 Kings had already embedded its deepest warning inside the brightest moment of establishment. The throne was secured. The question that would drive every chapter still to come was far more searching and far more personal. Would the king who sat upon that throne choose to walk, every single day of his reign, in the ways of the God who had given it to him? Part 3. The gift no king asked for. Solomon's dream and the wisdom of God. If you were to survey the prayers of the great kings of the ancient world, the pharaohs of Egypt who petitioned their gods for military conquest, the Babylonian monarchs who sought divine favor for expanding territory, the Assyrian rulers who invoked their deities for dominance over neighboring peoples, you would find a remarkably consistent pattern. Great men asked for great power. They asked for victory over enemies, for the extension of borders, for the accumulation of resources that would make their names remembered across generations. This was the universal language of royal ambition in the ancient Near East, which is precisely why what Solomon asked for at Gibeon stands as one of the most extraordinary moments in the entire history of biblical kingship. He stood before the living God, the God who had just offered him anything he desired, and he asked not for himself, but for the people entrusted to his care. He asked for the capacity to serve them well. In a world that worshipped power, Solomon asked for wisdom, and in doing so, he revealed the true condition of his heart at the beginning of his reign, a heart that understood, at least in that moment, that the throne of Israel was not a seat of personal honor, but a burden of sacred responsibility. The events leading to that dream are themselves significant and carefully arranged by the narrator of 1 Kings. Solomon had begun his reign by forming an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, sealed by a royal marriage. He brought Pharaoh's daughter into the city of David as construction continued on the temple, his own palace, and the great wall surrounding Jerusalem. The text also notes that the people were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been completed. This detail requires careful understanding. Before the temple was established as the central sanctuary of Israel, worship was not yet fully centralized in Jerusalem in the way that later generations would come to understand it. Solomon loved the Lord and walked in the statutes of his father David. Yet the full structure of covenant worship was still being built around him. This was a kingdom in transition, spiritually sincere in its early direction, but architecturally and institutionally incomplete. Solomon went to Gibeon, the great high place of that era, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings upon the altar there. The scale of the offering reflects the seriousness of his approach. He was not performing religion casually. He was standing before God with the full weight of his new responsibility pressing upon him. And it was at Gibeon, During the night, that the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream and spoke the words that would define the beginning of his reign. Ask what I shall give you. Solomon's response to that divine invitation is a study in self-awareness and covenantal humility. He began not with his own request, but with gratitude and acknowledgement. He remembered the steadfast love God had shown to David, his father. He reflected on the extraordinary mercy by which God had placed him on the throne as a young man following a father whose greatness he openly acknowledged. Then he looked honestly at the reality before him. He was surrounded by a people too numerous to count. He was responsible for governing, judging, protecting, and leading a nation that carried the weight of God's covenant purposes in the world. And he said with remarkable transparency that he did not know how to go out or come in. The language of a leader who understands that the responsibilities of governance are larger than any single human being can manage through intelligence and personal strength alone. So he asked for an understanding heart. The Hebrew concept behind that phrase reaches beyond what the English word wisdom typically conveys. It speaks of a heart that hears deeply, that perceives the difference between what is true and what is false, what is just and what is corrupt, what serves the people and what destroys them. Solomon was asking for the capacity to govern with discernment, to be the kind of king whose judgments reflected the character of the God who had appointed him. The Lord was pleased, because Solomon had asked for wisdom rather than long life, rich, or the destruction of his enemies. God gave him a wise and discerning heart, unlike any person before or after him. And then God gave him what he had not asked for: wealth, honor, and the promise of long life if he continued to walk in the ways of the Lord. The blessing was breathtaking in its generosity. But even inside that generosity, the conditional thread was clearly visible. If Solomon walked faithfully, the gift of wisdom was not a guarantee of permanent favor. It was the beginning of a responsibility. Solomon awoke from the dream and returned immediately to Jerusalem, where he stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. The movement from Gibeon back to Jerusalem and to the ark is deeply intentional. The king who received wisdom in a dream returned to the place of covenant, the place where the presence of God among his people was most powerfully represented. And then wisdom was tested in the most immediate and human way possible. 2 women came before the king. They shared a house. Both had given birth. 1 child had died in the night. And now each woman stood before Solomon, claiming that the living child was hers. There were no witnesses. There was no documentary evidence. There was only one king, 2 mothers, and a life that depended entirely on the discernment of the man sitting on the throne. Solomon called for a sword. He commanded that the child be divided. The true mother cried out immediately, willing to surrender her child rather than see him destroyed. The other woman accepted the division. In that single revealing moment, Solomon saw what no witness could have testified to and no document could have proven. He identified the true mother through the language of her love, a love that prioritized the life of the child over her own claim. All Israel heard of the judgment. They stood in awe of their king, recognizing that the wisdom of God was truly at work in him to do justice. This was not merely intelligence on display. This was divine wisdom, living, active, penetrating into the hidden places of human motivation and bringing truth and life out of what appeared to be an impossible deadlock. The kingdom was young. The temple was not yet built. But the God who had appeared at Gibeon had already begun to demonstrate what he intended to do through the Son of David. If that son would only continue to walk before him faithfully, Part 4. The Kingdom in Full Bloom. Glory, Governance, and Global Fame. There are rare moments in the history of nations when everything seems to align at once. When the right leader sits on the throne at the right time. When the land is at peace. When the people are prosperous. When the borders are secure. And when the name of the nation carries weight among the surrounding powers of the world. These moments are brief by the measure of history. They are fragile in ways that those living inside them rarely fully appreciate. But when they occur, they shine with a brilliance that later generations look back upon with a mixture of admiration and longing. For the nation of Israel, that moment arrived in the middle chapters of Solomon's reign, the kingdom that had passed through the bloodshed of David's wars, the tension of succession, the conditional mercy shown to Adonijah, and the careful consolidation of royal authority now stood before the ancient world in a season of extraordinary peace, stability, and divinely granted prosperity. 1 Kings pauses at this peak deliberately, allowing the reader to stand inside the glory before the cracks begin to appear, so that when the fall eventually comes, its weight will be fully felt. Solomon was king over all Israel, and the administrative structure he built around that kingship reflected the seriousness with which he understood governance as a sacred responsibility. He appointed officials over every dimension of the kingdom: priests, secretaries, a recorder, a commander of the army, officers over the royal household, a supervisor of the forced labor, and a royal friend beneath the level of the central court. He organized the entire land of Israel into 12 administrative districts, each responsible for supplying provisions for the royal household for 1 month of the year. This was not merely bureaucratic efficiency. It was a statement about the reach and stability of the kingdom. Every region of the land was integrated into a single functioning system, contributing to the welfare of the whole. The ancient world understood clearly that a kingdom capable of organizing itself this comprehensively was a kingdom that had transcended the fragile tribal confederacy of earlier generations and become something genuinely formidable. Judah and Israel were described as many as the sand of the sea in multitude. They ate and they drank and they rejoiced. Every man dwelt safely under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the south. That image, a family at rest beneath their own vine and fig tree, was not accidental poetry. It was the ancient Near Eastern image of covenant blessing fully realized, a people secure in their land, unafraid of invasion, unthreatened by famine, free to enjoy the fruits of their labor in peace. The promises made to Abraham centuries before, a numerous people, a fertile land, blessing flowing outward to the nations, were casting their long shadow forward into this extraordinary season of Solomonic glory. The reach of Solomon's kingdom extended far beyond the borders of Israel itself. He ruled over a vast territory, and the surrounding nations brought tribute and served him throughout his lifetime. His relationship with Hiram, king of Tyre, had opened trade routes and access to resources that transformed Jerusalem from a regional capital into an internationally recognized center of wealth and culture. Solomon's chariot cities, his horsemen, and his strategic fortifications at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, cities whose ruins archaeologists have confirmed, demonstrated that this was a kingdom with genuine military and architectural presence in the ancient world. The international landscape of the 10th century before Christ was one in which Egypt was managing a period of relative weakness after the great imperial era of Ramesses. While Assyria had not yet risen to the terrifying dominance it would later achieve, this created a window, a historically unique opening. in which a well-governed kingdom in the land of Canaan could expand its influence and establish itself as a significant regional power. Solomon filled that window with exceptional strategic intelligence, diplomatic skill, and the resources that divine wisdom had helped him cultivate. But the text of 1 Kings never allows the political and administrative achievements of Solomon to become the final word about his greatness. It consistently returns to the deeper source of everything the kingdom had become. God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure and breadth of mind, like the sand on the seashore. His wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the great cedar of Lebanon to the humble hyssop that grew from the wall. He spoke of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. He engaged the entire created order as a subject of divinely illuminated understanding, seeing in the patterns of nature the fingerprints of the God who had made all things and ordered them according to his wisdom. People came from all nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon, sent by kings across the ancient world who had heard reports of his extraordinary mind and the quality of governance that flowed from it. This final dimension of Solomon's glory is perhaps the most theologically significant of all, precisely because it reveals the intended purpose of divine wisdom in the life of a leader. Wisdom was never meant to be a private possession, hoarded for personal advancement. It was meant to radiate outward, into governance, into justice, into understanding of the created world, into relationships with other nations, into the cultural and intellectual life of an entire people. When foreign kings sent their representatives to Jerusalem to hear Solomon speak, they were not simply attending a royal lecture. They were encountering a kingdom that demonstrated what human civilization could look like when it was organized around the fear of God and the pursuit of his wisdom. Israel was not meant to be a nation that turned inward, defined only by its religious boundaries and suspicious of all outside contact. It was meant to be, in this moment of its greatest flourishing, a light visible to the nations, a demonstration that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not a tribal deity, but the sovereign Lord of all creation, whose wisdom, when received and applied faithfully, could transform a people and draw the surrounding world toward the knowledge of the living God. The kingdom was at its zenith. The temple was still being prepared. The great years of building and international fame still lay ahead. But even now, at this peak of administrative brilliance and global recognition, the narrator of 1 Kings had already embedded within the story the truth that would make everything that followed so profoundly tragic. The greater the gift, the greater the responsibility it carried, and the brighter the kingdom shone in its season of glory, the more devastating the consequences would be when the heart of its king began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to turn away from the God who had given him everything. Part 5 Cedar, stone, and sacred purpose, building the house of the Lord. Every great civilization in the ancient world expressed its deepest convictions through architecture. The Egyptians built their pyramids as declarations of royal divinity and cosmic permanence. The Babylonians raised their towering ziggurats as mountains of connection between the earthly realm and the dwelling places of their gods. The Assyrians constructed massive palace complexes whose walls were covered with carved reliefs depicting royal power, military conquest, and divine favor. Visual propaganda carved permanently into stone to announce to every visitor that the king who ruled here was backed by forces no human enemy could overcome. Architecture in the ancient world was never merely functional. It was theological. It was political. It was a statement about who you were, what you believed, and what kind of power you served. When Solomon turned his attention to the building of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, he was not simply embarking on a construction project. He was making the most significant theological statement that the nation of Israel had ever made in permanent form. A declaration carved in cedar and stone and gold that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not a wandering deity of the wilderness, but the sovereign Lord of heaven and earth, whose name would dwell in a specific place among his chosen people and whose worship would be conducted with beauty, precision, and reverence appropriate to his majesty. The narrative of 1 Kings chapter 5 opens with the figure of Hiram, king of Tyre, a detail that carries more weight than it might initially appear to carry. Hiram had loved David. When news reached him that Solomon had been anointed king in David's place, he sent his servants to Solomon, not with demands or conditions, but with the continuation of a relationship built on genuine respect and mutual benefit. Solomon responded by sending back a message that reached across political boundaries to explain the sacred purpose behind the project he was about to undertake. He reminded Hiram that David had been unable to build the house for the name of the Lord because of the wars that surrounded his reign on every side. The sword had occupied the years that might otherwise have been devoted to the sanctuary. But now, Solomon declared, the Lord had given him rest. There was no adversary. There was no evil occurrence blocking the path forward. The season of peace that had seemed so glorious in the previous chapter now revealed its deeper purpose. The prosperity and stability of Solomon's early reign were not ends in themselves. They were the divinely created conditions for the work that David had longed to complete and that God had reserved for his son. The peace of the kingdom existed so that the house of the Lord could be built. Rest was given not merely for comfort but for consecrated labor. This reframing of Solomon's peaceful reign as the appointed context for temple construction transforms the way the reader understands everything that came before it. The administrative order, the international alliances, the wisdom, the prosperity, all of it was building toward this moment. The glory of the kingdom was in service of a higher glory. Solomon requested from Hiram the cedar trees of Lebanon, those magnificent forests along the Phoenician coast that were among the most prized building materials in the entire ancient world. Lebanese cedar was famous throughout the Near East for its fragrance, its durability, its resistance to decay, and its extraordinary beauty. Egyptian pharaohs had imported it, Mesopotamian kings had coveted it, and now the king of Israel would use it to build the house for the name of the God of Israel. An agreement was formed between the two kings. Hiram would supply cedar and cypress timber, floated down the coast by sea, in exchange for vast quantities of wheat and olive oil to provision his household year by year. The arrangement was sealed not merely as a commercial transaction, but as an expression of the peaceful international relationships that characterized Solomon's reign at its best. What followed was an enormous mobilization of human labor and material resources that would have been immediately recognizable to any observer of major ancient construction projects. Solomon raised a levy of forced labor from across Israel, sending tens of thousands of workers in rotating shifts to Lebanon, tens of thousands more to cut stone in the mountains of Israel, and thousands of overseers to manage the work and maintain its quality. Great stones, costly stones. The text says, stones of extraordinary size were quarried and prepared for the foundation of the house. The builders of Solomon and the builders of Hiram worked together alongside skilled craftsmen from Gilead, shaping timber and cutting stone with the precision that a project of this magnitude demanded. But one detail, embedded within the construction account, carries a theological significance that transcends all the logistical and architectural descriptions surrounding it. The stones were prepared at the quarry before they were brought to the building site. When the stones arrived in Jerusalem and were set in place, no hammer, no axe, and no iron tool was heard at the house while it was being built. The noise and violence of iron striking stone, the raw, disruptive sound of human labor breaking and reshaping the natural world, was deliberately absent from the sacred site itself. The temple rose in Jerusalem in a kind of reverent silence, its massive stones fitted together with extraordinary care, the whole structure ascending not in the chaos of a construction zone, but in the ordered, almost worshipful atmosphere of a space being prepared for the holiest purpose imaginable. This detail speaks volumes about how Israel was meant to understand the house of the Lord. It was not a building project like other building projects. Every element of its construction, from the sourcing of the timber in distant Lebanon to the final placement of prepared stones in Jerusalem, was meant to reflect the character of the God for whom it was being built. A God of order, beauty, holiness, and breathtaking majesty. The 480th year after the Exodus from Egypt marked the beginning of construction in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. That chronological anchor is enormously important. The temple is being placed within the full sweep of Israel's redemptive history. The God who heard the cry of slaves in Egypt, who parted the sea, who thundered from Sinai, who led his people through 40 years of wilderness provision, who brought them into the promised land. That same God was now the God for whom a house was rising in the city of David. The temple was not a new beginning disconnected from everything that came before. It was the continuation of a story that had been moving purposefully forward since the first promise spoken to Abraham. And Solomon, standing at the center of its construction, was the instrument through whom centuries of divine faithfulness were now finding their architectural expression in the heart of Jerusalem. Part 6. Gold, bronze, and glory, furnishing the dwelling place of God. There is a difference between a building that is completed and a building that is ready. A structure can have its walls raised, its roof sealed, its foundations set deep into the earth, and still be fundamentally unfinished, waiting for the furnishings, the fixtures, the objects of purpose that will transform an empty architectural shell into a living, functioning space. The temple in Jerusalem was no different. The cedar lined walls had been raised. The stones prepared at the quarry had been set in place in reverent silence. The inner sanctuary, the most holy place, had been shaped and positioned at the heart of the structure to receive the most sacred object in the possession of the nation of Israel. But between the completed architecture and the moment when God's glory would fill the house, there remained an entire world of sacred craftsmanship that 1 Kings describes with extraordinary attention to detail. Bronze pillars and a great sea, golden lampstands and golden tables, carved cherubim whose outstretched wings spanned the entire width of the inner sanctuary, bowls and pots and shovels and basins, each one crafted with precision and placed according to divinely ordered purpose. The furnishing of the temple was not decoration. It was theology made tangible, a material language through which Israel communicated its understanding of holiness, sacrifice, cleansing, and the awesome presence of the living God. Before returning to the temple's interior, 1 Kings pauses to describe Solomon's own palace complex, and the contrast in construction time is immediately striking. The house of the Lord had taken 7 years to build. Solomon's palace complex took 13, This detail has generated considerable reflection across generations of biblical interpretation. Some have read it as evidence of misplaced priorities, that Solomon invested more time in his own dwelling than in God's house. But a closer reading of the text suggests a more nuanced picture. The palace complex was not a single building, but an extensive series of royal structures. The house of the forest of Lebanon, with its great cedar pillars, the Hall of Pillars, the Hall of the Throne, where judicial decisions would be rendered before all Israel, and a separate residence prepared for Pharaoh's daughter whom Solomon had married. These were the architectural organs of a functioning kingdom, spaces where justice would be administered, diplomacy conducted, and the governance of a vast territory managed. The palace was the body of the kingdom's institutional life. The temple was its soul. Both were necessary. Both reflected the seriousness with which Solomon understood the twin responsibilities of royal governance and covenant worship. But the narrator of 1 Kings ensures that the temple always carries the greater theological weight, returning the reader's attention to its sacred furnishings after every excursion into the details of royal architecture. Into this scene of extraordinary craftsmanship stepped one of the most remarkable figures in the entire construction narrative, a man named Huram, brought from Tyre by Solomon to oversee the most demanding and technically sophisticated elements of the temple's furnishing. Huram was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali and a father from Tyre, and the text describes him as filled with wisdom, understanding, and skill for every kind of work in bronze. He was not merely a skilled artisan. He was a man whose technical mastery was described in language that deliberately echoed the description of Bezalel, the craftsman appointed by God to build the wilderness tabernacle centuries before. The choice of language was not accidental. The furnishing of the temple stood in direct continuity with the furnishing of the tabernacle, both projects driven by divinely given skill, both dedicated to creating spaces and objects worthy of the worship of the God of Israel. Under Huram's extraordinary hand, the temple received furnishings of breathtaking scale and beauty. 2 bronze pillars were cast and erected at the entrance of the temple, each of remarkable height and crowned with elaborately decorated capitals adorned with lilies and chains and pomegranates. Solomon named them Jachin and Boaz, names that scholars have understood to carry meanings related to establishment and strength. The twin foundations upon which the house of the Lord and the kingdom it represented were meant to stand. Then came the great bronze sea, a massive circular basin of extraordinary capacity, resting upon the backs of 12 bronze oxen, arranged in 4 groups of 3, facing outward toward the 4 directions of the compass. The bronze sea was used by the priests for ritual washing, but its symbolism extended far beyond its practical function. The 12 oxen beneath it represented the 12 tribes of Israel, the entire covenant people, bearing together the weight of cleansing and consecration that the worship of a holy God required. Around the temple court stood 10 bronze stands with wheels, decorated with panels depicting lions, oxen, and cherubim, each stand holding a basin for the washing of the burnt offerings. Everything had a place. Everything served a purpose connected to the worship of God. Sacrifice, cleansing, consecration, and the constant, ordered movement of priestly service that kept the covenant relationship between Israel and its God alive and functioning day after day. Inside the temple itself, the golden furnishings spoke a different language, not the language of bronze strength and practical cleansing, but the language of divine holiness and royal beauty. The inner sanctuary, the most holy place, was overlaid entirely with gold. The altar before it was golden. The 10 golden lampstands illuminated the interior with warm, sacred light, The golden table held the bread of the presence. The doors of the inner sanctuary and the doors of the nave were overlaid with gold and carved with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, imagery that reached back through the memory of Israel to the Garden of Eden, where cherubim had stood as guardians of sacred space, and the presence of God had walked among his creation in the cool of the day. The carvings were not random artistic choices. They were a deliberate theological vocabulary, announcing that the temple was a restored garden, a renewed point of meeting between the holy God and his people, a place where the broken intimacy of Eden was being partially, provisionally, and beautifully addressed through the covenant system of sacrifice and worship. Solomon also brought into the temple all the things his father David had dedicated, silver and gold and vessels, placing them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. The temple received not only what Solomon had commissioned, but what David had set apart across decades of devoted preparation. Father and son, separated by death, but united in covenant purpose. Both contributed to the furnishing of the house that would bear the name of the Lord in Jerusalem. By the time the last golden overlay was applied and the last bronze vessel was set in its appointed place, the temple stood complete in its furnishing, a structure of staggering beauty, deliberate symbolism, and sacred purpose, waiting now for the one thing that no human craftsman, however gifted, could provide. It was waiting for the God whose name it bore to come and fill it with his glory. Part 7. The prayer that looked forward. Solomon's dedication and God's sobering response. There are prayers that are spoken for the moment, and there are prayers that are spoken for the ages. There are prayers that address the immediate circumstance and prayers that reach forward across centuries, anticipating realities that the one praying will never personally witness, but whose shadow they can already sense moving toward them from the future. Solomon's dedicatory prayer at the completion of the temple is one of the most extraordinary prayers in the entire biblical record, not simply because of its beauty, not simply because of the grandeur of the occasion that surrounded it, but because of the breathtaking theological depth it contained and the remarkable prophetic foresight with which it looked beyond the celebrations of that present moment into the long and complicated future that lay ahead for the nation of Israel. To stand inside this prayer is to encounter a king who understood his God in ways that few rulers in the ancient world came close to comprehending. It is also to encounter, embedded within the brightest single moment of Israel's national worship, a sobering acknowledgement that the glory of that moment was not guaranteed to last. The occasion itself was unlike anything Israel had ever witnessed. Solomon gathered the elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes, and the leaders of the ancestral houses to Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, that most sacred object of Israel's wilderness journey, the chest of acacia wood overlaid with gold that contained the 2 tablets of stone placed there by Moses at Horeb, was brought up from the city of David by the priests and Levites. Sacrifices were offered in such overwhelming abundance that they could not be counted or numbered. The ark was carried into the inner sanctuary of the completed temple, into the most holy place, and set beneath the outstretched wings of the great golden cherubim. Inside the ark, the text is careful to note, were only the 2 tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant, the foundational document of Israel's relationship with God. The record of the words spoken from the fire and the cloud at Sinai, when the Lord had taken a nation of freed slaves and bound them to himself in an eternal covenant of love and obligation. Then the priests came out of the holy place, and the cloud filled the house of the Lord. The glory of the Lord filled his house with such overwhelming, tangible, holy presence that the priests could not stand to minister. The building that had been 7 years in construction, that had consumed the timber of Lebanese forests and the bronze and gold of international trade, that had been raised in reverent silence and furnished with the skill of the finest craftsmen of the age. That building was now unmistakably, irrevocably marked as the dwelling place of the living God. No human achievement had produced that cloud. No architectural brilliance had generated that glory. God himself had come to confirm, in a manner visible to every person standing in Jerusalem that day, that he accepted the house prepared for his name. Solomon stood before the assembly and declared that the Lord had said he would dwell in thick darkness, a reference to the cloud of divine presence that had accompanied Israel from the beginning, and that he had built an exalted house, a place for the Lord to dwell forever. Then he turned and blessed all the assembly of Israel, remembering David, recounting the promise God had made to his father, and acknowledging that what stood before them was not primarily a monument to Solomonic achievement, but the fulfillment of a divine word spoken to a shepherd king who had longed to build this house, but was not appointed to do so. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly, spread his hands toward heaven, and prayed. And the prayer that followed was a theological masterpiece that has echoed through the worship of God's people across 3,000 years. He began with a declaration, "There is no God like the Lord in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and steadfast love with his servants who walk before him with all their heart." He acknowledged that even the heaven of heavens cannot contain God, that the temple, glorious as it was, could never serve as a cage for the infinite, uncountable, boundless Lord of all creation. He asked instead that God would hear from heaven, his dwelling place, and that when his people prayed toward this house, he would listen, forgive, and act. Then came the 7 petitions that formed the theological heart of the dedication. If a man sinned against his neighbor and came before the altar seeking justice, may God hear and judge. If Israel was defeated in battle because of sin and then turned back and confessed his name, may God hear from heaven and forgive and restore them to the land. If the heavens were shut and there was no rain because the people had sinned, but they prayed toward this place and turned from their sin, may God hear and teach them the good way and send rain upon the land. If famine came, or plague, or blight, or mildew, or locust, or enemy siege, whatever affliction or sickness, and the people spread out their hands toward the temple in prayer and repentance, may God hear from heaven, his dwelling place, forgive, and act. Each petition followed the same essential pattern: sin, consequence, repentance, prayer, divine mercy. Together they constructed a theology of grace that was radical in its generosity and serious in its conditions. Then Solomon prayed for the foreigner, the person from a distant country who came to Jerusalem because they had heard of the great name of the Lord and wanted to pray toward this house. He asked that God would hear the foreigner's prayer too, so that all the peoples of the earth would come to know his name and fear him as Israel did. The temple in Jerusalem was never intended to be a monument to Israelite exclusivity. It was meant to be a point of divine encounter so powerful and so beautiful that it would draw the surrounding nations toward the knowledge of the one true God. And finally, with a prophetic courage that must have felt startling in the midst of such extraordinary celebration, Solomon's prayer turned its gaze toward the darkest possible future. If the people sinned, and he acknowledged plainly that there was no one who did not sin, and if God gave them over to their enemies, and they were carried away captive into a foreign land. Yet if they came to themselves in that distant place and repented with all their heart and soul and prayed toward the land, the city, and the house, may God hear from heaven and maintain their cause and forgive. The word exile had been spoken. Standing in Jerusalem at the peak of the kingdom's glory, with the cloud of God's presence still filling the temple and the sound of celebration surrounding the city, Solomon's prayer had already looked far enough forward to see the terrible consequence of sustained covenant unfaithfulness. The temple was being dedicated in glory, but the prayer of its dedication was honest enough to acknowledge that glory is never permanent where obedience is absent. When Solomon finished praying, he rose and blessed the assembly and called the people to be wholly true to the Lord, walking in his statutes and keeping his commandments. Then God appeared to Solomon a second time. As he had appeared at Gibeon, he confirmed that he had consecrated the house, that his eyes and his heart would be there perpetually. But he also delivered the warning that transformed the dedicatory moment from pure celebration into serious covenant responsibility. If Solomon walked faithfully as David had walked, the throne would be established. But if he or his sons turned aside and went after other gods, Israel would be cut off from the land, and the glorious house that had just been filled with divine glory would become a ruin and a warning among the nations. The temple was consecrated, the warning was given, and the future of everything depended on the answer to a single question that only the unfolding of history could provide. Part 8. When glory begins to crack. The seeds of Solomon's downfall. There is a particular kind of spiritual danger that accompanies extraordinary success. It is not the danger of sudden, dramatic rebellion, the kind of failure that announces itself loudly and breaks cleanly from everything that came before it. It is something far more subtle and far more devastating. It is the danger of gradual drift, the slow, almost imperceptible movement of a heart away from the God who gave every gift it possesses, carried along not by a single catastrophic decision, but by 1,000 small compromises, each one seemingly manageable, each one justified by circumstances that appear reasonable in the moment, each one opening the door a little wider to the next, until the distance between where a person stands and where they began is so vast that the journey back seems almost unimaginable. This is the tragedy at the heart of Solomon's story. He did not fall overnight. He drifted across decades, and the record of that drift, embedded within the chapters that describe the very peak of his fame and prosperity, is one of the most searching and sobering portraits of spiritual failure in the entire biblical narrative. 1 Kings does not protect the reader from the painful truth that the greatest human gifts, when separated from sustained covenant faithfulness, can become the very instruments of a person's undoing. The chapters immediately following the temple dedication present Solomon's kingdom at the height of its international prestige and material magnificence. His trade relationship with Hiram of Tyre continued to generate extraordinary wealth. Gold arriving in Jerusalem in quantities that transformed the entire economic landscape of the royal court. Shields of beaten gold were made for the house of the forest of Lebanon. A great throne of ivory overlaid with fine gold was constructed, a throne unlike anything produced in any kingdom of that era, with 6 steps leading up to it, a rounded top at its back, armrests on either side, and 12 lions standing on the 6 steps. Silver in Jerusalem became as common as stone. Cedar was as plentiful as the sycamore trees of the lowlands. Ships of Tarshish brought gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks once every 3 years. arriving in a display of international commerce that announced to the entire ancient world that the Kingdom of Israel under Solomon had become a genuine center of global trade and cultural exchange. Then came the Queen of Sheba, a ruler from a wealthy and sophisticated kingdom in the south, likely corresponding to the region of ancient Yemen and Ethiopia, a land famous in the ancient world for its gold, its spices, and its formidable commercial networks. She had heard reports of Solomon's wisdom, and she came with a great caravan, laden with spices and gold and precious stones. To test him with hard questions, Solomon answered everything she asked. Nothing was hidden from him that he could not explain. When she saw his wisdom, the house he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath left in her. She declared openly that the report she had heard in her own land was true, but that the half had not been told. His wisdom and prosperity exceeded everything she had imagined. Then she blessed the Lord God of Israel, who had delighted in Solomon and set him on the throne to execute justice and righteousness. Even this foreign queen, standing in Jerusalem, surrounded by the evidence of Solomon's extraordinary reign, could see that his greatness was connected to the love and purpose of the God of Israel. The nations were indeed coming. The wisdom was indeed radiating outward. Everything that the kingdom was meant to demonstrate to the world was visible and functioning at its highest possible level. But embedded within this portrait of breathtaking glory, the book of 1 Kings quietly begins to sound notes of warning that a careful reader cannot miss. The accumulation of horses imported from Egypt, the multiplication of chariots and horsemen, the vast quantities of silver and gold flowing into the royal treasury year after year, these were not simply the natural consequences of successful governance. They were the precise violations that the law of Moses had anticipated and forbidden in its instructions for Israel's kings, recorded centuries earlier in the book of Deuteronomy. The king must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire more horses. He must not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, and he must not acquire excessive silver and gold. Solomon was violating every one of these three specific royal prohibitions simultaneously: multiplying horses from Egypt, multiplying wives through political marriages, and multiplying gold until silver was considered worthless. The Deuteronomic warnings for kings were not arbitrary restrictions on royal freedom. They were the accumulated wisdom of a God who understood precisely how power corrupts, how wealth distracts, and how the relentless pursuit of security through human means progressively displaces the trust in God that is the only true foundation of covenant life. And then, chapter 11 of 1 Kings delivers the devastating pivot that transforms everything the reader has witnessed about Solomon's reign. Solomon loved many foreign women, women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and the Hittites, nations concerning which the Lord had explicitly warned Israel not to intermarry, because their hearts would surely be turned after their gods. Yet Solomon clung to them in love, and when he was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. The king who had built the house of the Lord now built high places for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. He went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. He built shrines for the gods of his foreign wives on the hill east of Jerusalem. The man who had stood before the entire assembly of Israel and prayed that their hearts would be wholly true to the Lord had allowed his own heart to become divided. The wisdom that had astonished a foreign queen, the prayer that had anticipated exile and called a nation to repentance, the temple that had been filled with the glory of God. None of it had protected Solomon from the slow corrosion of a heart that chose the comfort of compromise over the demanding beauty of covenant faithfulness. The Lord became angry with Solomon because he had turned his heart away, and this despite the fact that God had appeared to him twice, had specifically commanded him not to go after other gods, and had warned him clearly of the consequences of disobedience. The judgment was announced with the same clarity as the warning had been given. The kingdom would be torn from Solomon and given to his servant. One tribe would remain for the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem. And the adversaries began to rise. Hadad the Edomite, Rezon the son of Eliada, and most significantly, Jeroboam the son of Nebat, a capable young man in Solomon's own service, whom the prophet Ahijah met on the road and addressed with the sign of a torn garment divided into 12 pieces. 10 pieces for Jeroboam. The image was unforgettable and irreversible. The kingdom that had shone with such breathtaking brilliance was already, in the purposes of God, beginning to tear along the seam of its king's divided heart. Part 9. The Torn Garment. The Kingdom Divided Forever. There is a moment in the life of institutions, families, and nations when a single decision, made in pride, made in haste, made with the arrogant certainty that power does not need to listen, changes everything that follows it forever. Not a gradual decline, but a sudden, irreversible fracture. A door that closes with such finality that no subsequent effort, no political maneuvering, no military campaign can fully reopen it. The division of the United Kingdom of Israel was that kind of moment. It did not arrive without warning. The prophet Ahijah had already torn a new garment into 12 pieces and pressed 10 of them into the hands of Jeroboam on a road outside Jerusalem, announcing that God was already in the process of tearing the kingdom from Solomon's house because of the idolatry that had entered the royal heart. The spiritual fracture had occurred before the political one became visible. But it is the political fracture, the moment when Rehoboam stood before the gathered assembly of Israel at Shechem and chose the counsel of arrogance over the counsel of wisdom, that 1 Kings records as the hinge point upon which the entire future of Israel turned. One speech, one rejection of wise counsel, one act of proud tone, deaf leadership, and the united kingdom that David had forged through decades of sacrifice and that Solomon had ruled at its most glorious peak was broken into 2 pieces that would never fully come back together again. Solomon was dead. 40 years of the most extraordinary reign in Israel's history had come to their end. And Rehoboam, his son, had traveled to Shechem, not to Jerusalem, significantly, but to Shechem, the ancient city of covenant assembly in the heart of the northern tribal territories, where all Israel had gathered to make him king. The people came not in rebellion but in petition. They carried with them the accumulated weariness of years of heavy labor and demanding royal service under Solomon, whose magnificent building projects had been sustained by a system of forced labor that placed enormous burdens on the ordinary families of Israel. Their request was straightforward, reasonable, and historically significant. They asked Rehoboam to lighten the heavy yoke his father had placed upon them. If he would do this, they promised to serve him faithfully. It was an invitation to begin his reign with a gesture of covenantal generosity, to acknowledge the humanity and the limits of the people he had been appointed to serve, and to demonstrate from the very first days of his kingship that he understood the difference between ruling over people and serving them well. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consider his answer, which at least suggested the capacity for deliberation. He went first to the older men who had stood before Solomon throughout his reign. experienced advisors whose wisdom had been shaped by decades of observing how power functioned and how people responded to it. Their counsel was both simple and profound. They told Rehoboam that if he would be a servant to the people that day, speak good words to them, and lighten their burden, the people would serve him forever. The path to enduring loyalty, they understood, was not domination but demonstrated care. A king who stooped to serve his people in their moment of legitimate need would bind them to himself more securely than any display of force could ever achieve. This was the accumulated wisdom of men who had watched Solomon govern at his best and at his worst, and who understood that the covenant between a king and his people, like the covenant between God and Israel, flourished through faithfulness and generosity, not through the exercise of raw, unchecked authority. But Rehoboam rejected the counsel of the older men entirely and turned instead to the young men who had grown up with him, his peers, his companions, men whose understanding of power was shaped not by decades of experienced observation, but by the intoxicating proximity to royal privilege they had enjoyed throughout their lives. Their advice was the opposite of wisdom in almost every measurable dimension. They told him to answer the people harshly, to make clear that his authority would be greater and more demanding than his father's, to declare that if Solomon had disciplined them with whips, Rehoboam would discipline them with scorpions. The language was designed to intimidate, to establish dominance from the very first moment of the new reign, to send the message that the people's petition was not an invitation to dialogue, but an act of presumption that deserved a crushing response. When the people returned on the third day for Rehoboam's answer and heard the words that came from the mouth of their new king, the response was immediate and irreversible. The cry rose from the gathered assembly like a wave breaking against stone. "What portion do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel! Look now to your own house." David, with those words, 10 tribes turned their backs on the house of David and walked away from the covenant of unified kingship that had been the defining political achievement of the previous 2 generations. Rehoboam's attempt to reassert control by sending Adoram, the official over the forced labor, ended in catastrophe. The people stoned him to death, and Rehoboam fled to Jerusalem in his chariot. The political break was total. But 1 Kings, characteristically, will not allow the reader to understand this rupture as merely a political event produced by a foolish young king's catastrophic leadership failure. The word of God came through the prophet Shemaiah, telling Rehoboam and the house of Judah not to go up and fight against their brothers in the northern tribes, because this thing had come from the Lord. The division was simultaneously the consequence of human foolishness and pride, and the instrument of divine judgment upon a kingdom that had drifted from covenant faithfulness under its previous king. Both dimensions are held together by 1 Kings without resolving the tension between them, because the tension itself is true. People are responsible for their choices. God is sovereign over the outcomes. The arrogance of Rehoboam was real. The judgment of God working through that arrogance was equally real. Jeroboam was established as king over the northern tribes, and now the story confronts its most theologically significant development since Solomon's idolatry. The religious system Jeroboam created to secure his political power. He understood that if the northern tribes continued to travel to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, their emotional and spiritual loyalty might gradually drift back toward the house of David. So he made 2 golden calves and erected them at Bethel in the south of his kingdom and Dan in its north, presenting them to the people with words that deliberately echoed the language of the Exodus. "Behold your gods, O Israel." who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He appointed priests from outside the tribe of Levi, established new feast days on dates he had devised from his own heart, and built houses of worship on high places across the land. The echo of the golden calf at Sinai was not accidental. Jeroboam was not openly denying the God of Israel. He was doing something more insidious. He was reshaping the worship of that God according to his own political needs, creating a religious system designed to serve the stability of his kingdom rather than the holiness of God. False worship, dressed in the familiar language of true faith, is always more dangerous than outright denial, because it offers the comfort of religious identity without the transforming demand of genuine covenant obedience. The sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. That phrase would echo through the remaining chapters of 1 Kings and far into the books that followed, attached like a permanent verdict to the name of every northern king who walked in his footsteps. A torn garment on a road outside Jerusalem had announced it. A foolish speech at Shechem had triggered it. And 2 golden calves set up in Bethel and Dan had institutionalized it into the spiritual DNA of an entire nation. Part 10. Kings and Consequences. The early rulers of a fractured nation. When a great institution fractures, the damage does not stop at the point of the initial break. It spreads. It deepens. It works its way into the foundations of everything that was built upon the assumption of wholeness. And it reveals with unsparing clarity which elements of the structure were genuinely solid and which were only held together by the pressure of circumstances that no longer exist. The division of the United Kingdom of Israel was exactly this kind of fracture. The moment Rehoboam fled to Jerusalem in his chariot, and Jeroboam established himself as king over the 10 northern tribes, 2 separate trajectories of covenant history were set in motion, trajectories that would diverge with increasing speed and increasing spiritual darkness as the generations passed. 1 Kings traces both of these trajectories with remarkable honesty, measuring every king not by the conventional standards of the ancient world, not by territory conquered, not by wealth accumulated, not by enemies defeated, but by a single, relentlessly applied theological standard. Did this king walk in the ways of the Lord, or did he walk in the way of Jeroboam, who made Israel to sin? That question, repeated across the reigns of king after king, is not a literary formula inserted mechanically by a careless editor. It is the heartbeat of the entire book, the recurring pulse that reminds the reader with every new reign that the covenant has not been forgotten, that God is still watching, and that history in Israel is not ultimately driven by political strategy or military strength, but by the condition of the hearts of those who sit upon its thrones. In Judah, the southern kingdom that retained Jerusalem, the temple, and the Davidic line of succession. The early post. Division kings presented a deeply mixed picture. Rehoboam himself, whose catastrophic speech at Shechem had shattered the kingdom, led Judah into spiritual compromise of its own. The people built high places, sacred pillars, and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree across the land. The spiritual condition of the southern kingdom, though it retained the temple in Jerusalem, was genuinely deteriorated. Then came the devastating blow that announced in material and visible terms what the spiritual decline had already accomplished invisibly. In the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. This was not a minor border skirmish. Shishak, known to history as Pharaoh Shoshenku I, whose military campaign into Canaan is confirmed by inscriptions discovered on the walls of the great temple at Karnak in Egypt, brought his army against the city, and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. Everything. The golden shields that Solomon had made for the house of the forest of Lebanon were taken, and Rehoboam replaced them with bronze shields, carrying them ceremonially whenever he entered the house of the Lord, and then returning them to the guardroom afterward. That single image, bronze, where gold had been. A careful ceremonial performance, maintaining the appearance of royal dignity while the substance of Solomon's glory was gone, is one of the most quietly devastating images in the entire book. The gold of the kingdom's greatest season had been carried away to Egypt. Bronze had taken its place. The outward form continued. The inner reality had been diminished in a way that no ceremonial performance could conceal. After Rehoboam came Abijam, whose reign continued the spiritual failures of his father. The text is direct in its evaluation. He walked in all the sins his father had done before him, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David had been. And yet, and this is one of the most theologically significant moments in these chapters, even for Abijam, even for this flawed and spiritually compromised king, God gave a lamp in Jerusalem for David's sake. The Davidic dynasty survived not because Abijam deserved it, but because God was keeping his word to David. Covenant mercy was sustaining a royal line that the behavior of its current occupant had done nothing to deserve. This is a truth that runs like a golden thread through the darkest sections of Israel's divided monarchy. The faithfulness of God outlasting the faithlessness of human kings, the covenant promise proving stronger than the covenant failures of those who were meant to embody it. Then came Asa, and the atmosphere of the narrative changed with unmistakable clarity. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. As David his father had done, his reform was direct and courageous. He removed the male cult prostitutes from the land, put away the idols his fathers had made, and demonstrated the personal courage of genuine spiritual leadership by removing his own grandmother, Maacah, from her position as queen mother because she had made an abominable image for Asherah. He cut down her image and burned it at the brook Kidron. The reform reached into the royal household itself, acknowledging that covenant faithfulness could not coexist comfortably with idolatry, even when the idol belonged to a powerful family member. The text is honest, however, that Asa's reform was real but incomplete. The high places were not taken away. The people still offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. But the evaluation of Asa's heart remained positive throughout his reign. His heart was wholly true to the Lord all his days, demonstrating that God measures the direction and sincerity of a person's devotion alongside the completeness of their reformation. While in the southern kingdom, Asa was bringing genuine, if incomplete, reform. The northern kingdom of Israel was descending through a rapid and violent succession of dynasties that revealed with brutal clarity the instability that results when a throne is built on political ambition and religious corruption rather than covenant faithfulness. Nadab the son of Jeroboam reigned and did evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of his father and in the sin by which Jeroboam had made Israel to sin. He lasted barely 2 years before Baasha conspired against him during a military campaign and struck him down, then proceeded to destroy every member of Jeroboam's household, fulfilling the prophetic words spoken against Jeroboam's house by Ahijah the Shilonite. But the tragedy embedded within this act of prophetic fulfillment was this Baasha, who became the instrument through which God's announced judgment on Jeroboam's house was executed, learned absolutely nothing from the judgment he himself carried out. He became king, and he also walked in the way of Jeroboam and in the sin by which he made Israel to sin. The cycle was not broken by the collapse of one dynasty. It simply transferred its destructive momentum to the next. Baasha's son Elah reigned after him, and his reign ended in the same violent manner as Nadab's, struck down by a conspiracy while drinking in the house of his steward, replaced by Zimri, who then destroyed every member of Baasha's household, exactly as Baasha had destroyed Jeroboam's. But Zimri's own reign lasted precisely 7 days before the army of Israel, encamped in the field, heard what had happened and made Omri their commander and king. Omri besieged Tirzah. Zimri burned the royal palace over himself rather than submit. And Israel acquired a new king through the same instrument of military force that had produced every northern king since Jeroboam. Omri was strong enough to purchase a hill and build upon it the city of Samaria, establishing a new capital that would define the northern kingdom for generations to come. But his spiritual legacy was summarized with devastating brevity by the narrator of 1 Kings. He did more evil than all who were before him. Each generation in the north was not merely repeating the sins of the previous one. It was deepening them, intensifying them, normalizing them further into the cultural and religious fabric of the kingdom until the next generation would inherit corruption as their default condition and call it tradition. And then Ahab the son of Omri came to the throne, and the book announced that what had already been described as the darkest era of Israel's northern kingdom was about to become darker still. Part 11. The Prophet from Gilead, Eliach, the Drought, and the Fire from Heaven. To understand the magnitude of what Elijah represented when he stepped out of the wilderness of Gilead and stood before Ahab, king of Israel, it is necessary to understand precisely what Ahab and Jezebel had built in Samaria. This was not simply a continuation of Jeroboam's corrupted worship system. The golden calves at Bethel and Dan, the unauthorized priesthood, the feast days devised from a king's own heart. What Ahab had introduced into the northern kingdom, largely through the influence of his Phoenician wife, Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, was something qualitatively different and far more aggressive. He had built a temple to Baal in Samaria itself, in the capital city, at the center of royal power, and erected an altar within it. He had made an Asherah. He had not merely tolerated foreign worship as a private accommodation to his wife's religious background. He had institutionalized it, funded it from the royal treasury, and given it the full weight of state endorsement. Jezebel had gone further still, actively hunting down and killing the prophets of the Lord, so that the faithful Obadiah had been forced to hide 100 of them in caves and sustain them secretly with bread and water at enormous personal risk. The worship of Baal was not a quiet corner of Israelite religious life under Ahab. It was the official religion of the northern kingdom, backed by royal authority, protected by royal power, and promoted by a queen whose commitment to her gods was as fierce and uncompromising as her political ambition. Baal was the storm deity of ancient Canaan, the god of thunder, lightning, rain, and agricultural fertility. Worshipped across the Phoenician coast and throughout the Canaanite world as the divine power responsible for the rains that made the land productive and the crops that kept populations alive. His worship was ancient, deeply embedded in the cultural memory of the land, and powerfully attractive to agricultural communities whose survival depended on the seasonal rains arriving reliably and in sufficient abundance. When Jezebel brought the organized, Templar-based Baal religion of Phoenicia into the center of Israel's royal life, she was not simply introducing a foreign novelty. She was offering the people of the northern kingdom a worship system that spoke directly to their most immediate and practical anxieties. Anxiety about rainfall, about harvest, about the fertility of the land and the survival of their families through the cycles of agricultural dependence. This is the theological landscape into which Elijah the Tishbite walked when he appeared before Ahab without introduction, without royal invitation, and without any of the elaborate protocol that the ancient Near Eastern court system demanded from those who sought an audience with a reigning monarch. He came with a single declaration that was simultaneously a theological challenge, a prophetic announcement, and the opening move in the most dramatic confrontation between true and false worship recorded anywhere in the biblical narrative. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. The heavens were closed. The drought had begun, and the battle line between the God of Israel and the gods of Canaan had been drawn with absolute clarity across the sky above the northern kingdom. If Baal controlled the rain, let him prove it. The land itself would become the evidence. What followed the announcement of drought was a sequence of divine provision and prophetic preparation that built systematically toward the great confrontation still to come. God sent Elijah to hide by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan, where ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening while he drank from the brook. The detail of the ravens is striking in its theological richness. The God who had closed the heavens over an entire kingdom was simultaneously providing for his servant through the most unlikely of messengers, using birds that the law of Moses classified as unclean to carry clean food to his prophet in a hidden place. When the brook eventually dried up because there was no rain in the land, the very drought Elijah had announced, now touching his own place of provision, God spoke again and sent him not deeper into Israel, but outward into Gentile territory, to Zarephath, which belonged to Sidon. The theological irony was pointed and intentional. Sidon was Jezebel's homeland. It was the heartland of the Phoenician Baal worship that had infected the northern kingdom. And it was precisely there, in the territory most closely associated with the false religion that Ahab and Jezebel had imported into Israel, that God was about to demonstrate his power over the very things Baal claimed to control: food, life, and the boundary between existence and death. The widow of Zarephath stood at the gate of the city, gathering sticks for what she believed would be the final meal of her life and the life of her son. Her flour was almost gone. Her oil was nearly exhausted. Famine had reduced her horizon to a single remaining day. Elijah asked her for water and then for bread, and she answered with the honesty of a woman who had nothing left to protect. What she had was spoken. What she feared was spoken. And then Elijah spoke the word of the Lord. The jar of flour would not be spent, and the jug of oil would not be empty, until the day the Lord sent rain upon the earth. She went and did as Elijah said. And day after day, in a house marked by famine, the Lord sustained life through provision that had no natural explanation. Then the widow's son became ill and died, and she cried out to Elijah from the depth of her grief. Elijah took the child to the upper room, laid him on his own bed, and cried out to the Lord with an intensity that the text preserves without commentary. The Lord heard his voice. The life of the child came into him again. Elijah brought him down and gave him to his mother, and she declared that now she knew without question that he was a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in his mouth was truth. God had demonstrated power over flour and oil, over life and death, over the boundaries of natural possibility, and he had done it in Sidon, in the heartland of Baal's supposed domain. The stage was fully set. In the 3rd year of the drought, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, telling him to show himself to Ahab because God would send rain. The confrontation on Mount Carmel that followed was one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of Israel's covenant relationship with God. Elijah stood before the gathered assembly of Israel and asked the question that cut through every layer of cultural accommodation, political convenience, and religious ambiguity that the people had been living inside for years. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. The people did not answer. Their silence was the sound of a nation that had learned to live comfortably in the space between commitment and compromise, worshipping the Lord and Baal simultaneously, never fully choosing, never fully surrendering, managing their religious obligations the way pragmatic people in every era manage inconvenient truths, by never forcing the question to a decisive point. Elijah forced it. The prophets of Baal called from morning until noon, crying out to their God, cutting themselves according to their custom, performing with desperate energy every ritual their tradition prescribed. No voice answered. No fire fell. No one paid attention. Then Elijah repaired the broken altar of the Lord, set 12 stones according to the 12 tribes of Israel, arranged the offering, and commanded that water be poured over everything until the trench around the altar was filled. At the time of the evening offering, he prayed. Not a performance, not a lengthy public display, but a direct, covenantal cry to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. The fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and the water in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and cried out the confession that the entire confrontation had been designed to produce. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. The heavens then grew dark with clouds and wind. A great rain came. The drought was over. The Lord who had closed the sky had opened it again. And every drop of rain that fell on the parched land of Israel was a declaration that the God of the covenant, not Baal, not Jezebel's imported religion, not the compromised worship of a kingdom that had been limping between two opinions for too long, was and had always been the only true source of life. Part 12, The Still Small Voice. Elias' collapse, God's restoration, and the word that will not fail. There is a truth about spiritual exhaustion that the church across the centuries has often been reluctant to speak plainly, that the people who carry the heaviest burdens of faithful witness, who stand in the most exposed positions of prophetic courage, who pour themselves out most completely in obedience to God's calling, are frequently the most vulnerable to the particular kind of collapse that comes not from moral failure, but from the sheer accumulated weight of faithful service in the face of relentless opposition. Elijah had just stood alone on Mount Carmel against 850 false prophets. He had prayed, and fire had fallen from heaven. He had watched the people of Israel fall on their faces and confess that the Lord was God. He had prayed again, and the rain had returned after 3 years of devastating drought. He had run before Ahab's chariot to the entrance of Jezreel with the supernatural strength of a man operating at the very outer limits of human capacity. By every visible measure, the confrontation on Carmel had been an overwhelming victory. The God of Israel had been publicly vindicated. Baal had been publicly exposed as silent, powerless, and absent. The people had confessed the truth. The rain had come. Everything that Elijah had been sent to accomplish appeared to have been accomplished. And then Jezebel sent her messenger with a single sentence that undid everything the fire and the rain had appeared to settle. threatening that by the next day Elijah's life would end, as the lives of the prophets of Baal had ended. And Elijah, the man who had stood unmoved before Ahab and before hundreds of false prophets, ran for his life into the wilderness. The flight of Elijah into the desert is one of the most humanly recognizable moments in the entire biblical record. He had given everything he had. The victory on Carmel had not produced the national transformation he had perhaps hoped for. Jezebel still held power. The structures of Baal worship were not dismantled in a day. The king who had witnessed the fire of God consume the altar had ridden back to Jezreel and reported everything to his wife rather than falling on his knees in repentance. The gap between what Elijah had hoped the confrontation would produce and what it had actually changed in the corridors of power was wide enough to be crushing. He sat under a broom tree in the wilderness south of Beersheba, a man emptied of everything, and he asked God to take his life. He said he was no better than his fathers. He lay down and slept. And then came the response of God to his servant's collapse. And it is a response that carries more theological weight and more pastoral wisdom than many extended theological treatises on the nature of divine care. An angel touched him. Not a vision, not a dramatic heavenly appearance. A touch. And near his head there was bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. Arise and eat. The first response of God to the prophet's exhaustion was not a lecture about faith. It was not a rebuke about fear. It was not a theological correction about the true meaning of the Carmel victory. It was food. It was water. It was rest. It was the simple, profound, irreducibly human care of a God who understood that his servant's body was as real as his servant's calling, and that a man who has poured himself out completely needs to be filled before he can be commissioned again. Elijah ate and drank and lay down again. The angel came a second time. Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. In the strength of that food, Elijah traveled 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God, the same mountain where Moses had stood before the burning bush, where the covenant had been given to Israel in fire and thunder and thick cloud, where the Lord had revealed himself to his people at the foundational moment of their national existence. The journey to Horeb was not merely geographical, it was theological. A return to the place of covenant origins, a movement back toward the source of everything Israel's prophetic tradition had been built upon. At Horeb, inside a cave in the mountain, the word of the Lord came to Elijah with a question that was simultaneously gentle and searching. What are you doing here? Elijah. The question was not hostile. It was an invitation to articulate the interior reality that the outward flight had expressed. Elijah answered from the accumulated pain of his experience. He had been very jealous for the Lord. The people had forsaken the covenant, thrown down the altars, killed the prophets, and he alone was left. And now his own life was being sought. Then the Lord told him to go out and stand on the mount before him. A great and strong wind tore through the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake shook the mountain. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire swept through. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came the sound of a low whisper, a still, small voice, a sound of gentle stillness. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. The sequence is among the most profound theological moments in the entire Old Testament. At Sinai, God had come in fire and earthquake and thick cloud and the sound of a trumpet. Overwhelming, terrifying, undeniable in its dramatic power. But here, to a prophet broken by exhaustion and fear, God came in the opposite register entirely. not in the wind that broke the rocks, not in the earthquake that shook the mountain, not in the fire that swept through, in the gentle whisper, in the quiet voice, the same God who had answered by fire on Carmel, publicly, dramatically, unmistakably, now spoke to his weary servant in the language of intimate, careful, restorative presence. God was showing Elijah something essential about the nature of divine sovereignty. The spectacular confrontation on Carmel was real. The fire was real. The rain was real. But the ongoing work of God in the world was not always going to look like fire falling from heaven. Sometimes it was going to sound like a quiet word spoken in a cave on a mountain to a man who had run out of everything. Then God gave Elijah a new commission. Go, return, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Anoint Jehu as king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, as prophet in your place. The story was not finished. Kings were yet to be appointed. Judgment was yet to be executed. A successor was yet to be raised up. And then God corrected the one thing in Elijah's self-assessment that had been distorted by isolation and exhaustion. Elijah had said he alone was left. God said there were 7,000 in Israel. 7,000 whose knees had not bowed to Baal and whose mouths had not kissed him. The prophet who felt utterly alone in the battle was surrounded by a hidden remnant that his circumstances had prevented him from seeing. This revelation reframes everything. The faithfulness of God was operating on a scale far larger than any single prophet's field of vision could encompass. Elisha was called and commissioned as Elijah threw his cloak upon him. And Elisha left his oxen, burned his equipment, said his farewells, and rose to follow. Then came Naboth's vineyard, one of the most morally devastating scenes in all of 1 Kings. Ahab wanted Naboth's land for a vegetable garden. Naboth refused, because the land was his family's inheritance under the covenant order of God. Ahab sulked. Jezebel acted. False witnesses were arranged. Naboth was accused of cursing God and the king, taken outside the city, and destroyed. Then Ahab rose to take possession of the dead man's vineyard, and Elijah was sent again, to meet the king standing in the stolen field and to deliver the word of the Lord that no act of injustice, however carefully arranged, however legally disguised, however protected by royal power, could ever place itself beyond the reach of divine judgment. Ahab tore his clothes and humbled himself. And God noticed. The judgment was delayed but not cancelled. Then Micaiah spoke truth to Ahab before the disastrous battle at Ramoth, Gilead, surrounded by 400 prophets offering comfortable approval. The one true prophet saw Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd and declared that Ahab would not return in peace. Ahab disguised himself in battle, hoping to hide from the word that had been spoken against him. But a man drew his bow at random, and the arrow found the king of Israel between the joints of his armor. He was propped up in his chariot facing the battle until evening. And at evening he died. The dogs licked his blood as the word of the Lord had spoken. No disguise, no strategy, no surrounding of oneself with agreeable voices can outrun the word of the living God. Part 13. The Unfinished Throne. What 1 Kings demands of us today. Every great story carries within it a question that outlives the events it describes. A question that the narrative raises not merely for the people who lived inside it, but for every generation that encounters it afterward and finds, sometimes with startling and uncomfortable clarity, that the same question is being asked of them. The book of 1 Kings is that kind of story. It begins with a throne in transition and ends with a kingdom still divided, still struggling, still measuring its kings against a standard that most of them failed to meet. It traces the arc of one of the most extraordinary civilizations in the ancient world, from the breathtaking heights of Solomonic glory to the devastating fractures of the divided monarchy. And it does so not merely as a historical record of what happened to a particular nation in a particular era of the ancient Near East, but as a living theological document whose central message presses itself with equal force upon every human heart that encounters it. The question First Kings asks is not complicated. It can be stated simply and directly. Will you walk faithfully before God with a whole heart? Or will you allow the slow drift of compromise to carry you away from the covenant that is the only true foundation of lasting life? That question was asked of Solomon at the height of his wisdom. It was asked of Rehoboam at the beginning of his reign. It was asked of Jeroboam when fear drove him to create a religious system designed to serve his political security rather than the holiness of God. It was asked of Ahab through the thundering declaration of Elijah on Mount Carmel. And it is being asked of every person who has followed this story from its opening chapter to its final verse. Look at what this book has shown us across its 22 chapters of compressed, searching, and profoundly honest history. It showed us David, a king whose body was failing, but whose covenant understanding remained clear enough in his final hours to charge his son with the truth that the throne of Israel was not a political achievement, but a sacred responsibility. That prosperity without obedience was a temporary illusion. And that walking in the ways of the Lord was not one option among many, but the only foundation upon which a life or a kingdom could be genuinely and permanently built. It showed us Solomon, a man who began with a prayer of such extraordinary humility and covenantal wisdom that God himself declared it the finest request he had ever been asked, who received wisdom beyond measure and built the most magnificent house of worship the ancient world had ever seen, whose dedicatory prayer looked forward across centuries and anticipated exile with a theological foresight that should have been enough to keep any king faithful for an entire lifetime, and yet whose heart drifted, not in a single dramatic act of rebellion, but across years of small accommodations, political marriages, foreign alliances, multiplied horses, accumulated gold, and the gradual normalization of divided worship until the king who had built the house of the Lord was building shrines to Chemosh and Molech on the hills outside Jerusalem, and the God who had appeared to him twice was announcing the tearing of his kingdom. It showed us the torn garment on the road and the torn kingdom at Shechem, and it taught us that the external fractures that appear in institutions, families, and nations are almost always preceded by internal fractures that began long before the breaking point became visible to the watching world. It showed us Jeroboam's golden calves and taught us that the most dangerous corruptions of worship are not those that openly deny God, but those that reshape the approach to God according to human convenience, political calculation, and the management of people's religious loyalties for personal advantage. False worship dressed in the language of true faith. Golden calves presented as the gods who brought Israel out of Egypt. An entire religious system built not on the word of the Lord, but on the fears of a king who did not trust God enough to govern without controlling how and where the people worshipped. And then it showed us Elijah, the prophet who walked out of the wilderness with nothing but the word of the Lord and stood before a king who had done more to provoke God to anger than any king before him. It showed us ravens carrying food to a hidden brook, a widow's jar of flour that never emptied, a child restored to life in an upper room in Sidon, fire falling on a water, soaked altar on Mount Carmel, and rain returning after 3 years of devastating drought. And through every one of these extraordinary demonstrations of divine power, it taught us the same truth that the entire book had been building toward from its very first chapter. God is sovereign. His word does not fail. His purposes are not derailed by the ambitions of scheming princes, or the silence of intimidated congregations, or the threats of powerful queens, or the disguises of frightened kings. He raises up and he tears down. He closes the heavens and he opens them again. He speaks in fire on a mountain, and he speaks in a gentle whisper in a cave. He feeds his exhausted servants under broom trees, and he sends them on journeys of 40 days with the strength of a single meal. He preserves 7,000 faithful people in the darkest era of a nation's spiritual history and reveals them to a prophet who believed he was completely alone. He appoints kings and anoints prophets and executes judgments across generations with a patience and a precision that no human political strategy can anticipate or outmaneuver. And through it all, through the glory and the failure, through the faithfulness and the rebellion, through the gold and the bronze shields that replaced it, he keeps calling his people back, back to the covenant, back to the altar, back to the wholehearted worship that is the only appropriate response to the God who delivered them from Egypt, settled them in the promised land, filled the temple with his glory, heard their prayers across the centuries, and never once abandoned the purpose he had set his heart upon from the beginning. This is the message of 1 Kings. And it is the message that this generation needs to hear with the same urgency that Israel needed to hear it in the divided kingdom era. Because the same temptations are present today in different forms. The temptation to build impressive religious structures while allowing the heart to drift from genuine covenant faithfulness. The temptation to surround ourselves with voices that tell us only what we want to hear. The temptation to worship God on our own terms rather than His. The temptation to manage our lives through human strategy and accumulated security rather than through the risky, demanding, transforming practice of trusting the living God with everything we are and everything we have. If this journey through 1 Kings has spoken to your heart, if you have seen yourself somewhere in Solomon's drift, or in Rehoboam's pride, or in the exhausted prophet under the broom tree, or in the people on Mount Carmel who had been limping between two opinions for too long, then this is your moment. Type in the comments below these words as your declaration. I have heard the message of 1 Kings. My heart will be wholly the Lord's. This is not merely a comment. It is a confession. It is a covenant statement. It is your way of saying that you have seen what happens when wisdom is separated from obedience, when worship is replaced by convenience, when the heart of a king or the heart of an ordinary person drifts by slow degrees away from the God who gave every good thing they possess. Share in the comments what part of this book moved you most deeply. Was it Solomon's prayer in the temple? Was it the fire on Carmel? Was it the still small voice after the wind and the earthquake and the fire? Was it Naboth's vineyard and the word of the Lord that found Ahab even in the stolen field? Your testimony may be exactly what another person needs to open their Bible. Return to God and choose faithfulness in a world full of the same golden calves that destroyed Jeroboam's legacy. And if you do not yet know Jesus Christ in a personal and living way, hear this clearly. He is the greater Solomon. He is the true king whose wisdom never drifted, whose heart was never divided, whose obedience never faltered even when the path led through suffering and death. He is the temple that was torn down and raised again in 3 days. He is the one in whom all the covenant promises of God find their final and eternal yes. His kingdom will never be divided. His throne will never be inherited by a son who makes it worse. His word will never return to him empty. Turn to him today, not tomorrow, not in another season when circumstances seem more favorable. Today, the message of 1 Kings is the message of every generation. A heart can drift slowly and imperceptibly until it is very far from where it began. But the mercy of God is still calling. His voice is still speaking, and he is still the God who answers by fire, who whispers in caves, who feeds his servants in the wilderness, and who is faithful to every covenant promise he has ever made to every heart that turns to him with sincerity and truth.